Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have two special guests. We have John Michaels. He's a UCLA professor of law, specializing in constitutional, administrative, and national security law. We have David Noll. He's the associate dean for faculty research and development and a professor of law at Rutgers Law School. And their new book, available October 8th, is called Vigilante Nation: How State-Sponsored Terror Threatens Our Democracy. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on, and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely. And so, as we usually do, we're going to start with a passage from the book. So the authors wrote, "Vigilante democracy is not the brainchild of any one politician, philosopher, activist, or lawyer. It was not hatched all at once by an assembly of right-wing culture warriors. Bits and pieces of the project were crafted and refined over time across dozens of states, counties, and municipalities, and at least at first, with little awareness of how or whether the pieces would come together. But come together they have. Across huge swaths of the United States, vigilante democracy is transforming how Americans work, have fun, study, love, and participate in the civic and political life of their communities and their country. Relying on legions of citizen culture warriors, everyone from PTA moms to abortion snitches to heavily armed white nationalist militiamen, vigilante democracy is resurrecting and enforcing, at times with violence, traditional status hierarchies and punishing women, racial and religious minorities, and LGBTQ plus people who make dignity and equality demands that threaten white Christian political and cultural power." So let's just start it off with a simple question. I'm going to start it off with you, David. So what is vigilante democracy?
So we started working on this in 2021, coming right out of the January 6th insurrection. And, the insurrection was a shock. As it happened, a lot of us were struggling to understand what had happened. But John and I were looking at what was happening in the states right after the insurrection. And what we saw was an effort, rather than sort of closing the door on vigilantes and saying, no, right, we don't want these kind of efforts to be part of our politics. What we saw is a group of lawyers, lawmakers, right-wing activists really leaning into the idea of vigilantism. And the thing we saw that really concerned us was that, in addition to simply encouraging vigilantes, states were enacting laws and enacting policies that supported them. So vigilante democracy is the label that we use to talk about a world where this coalition of vigilantes, right? Everyone from abortion snitches to heavily armed militiamen who are likely going to appear outside of polling sites over the next couple of weeks, are an omnipresent force in our society, and particularly in the red states that are empowering these guys. And what we're trying to do in the book is show how that changes our democracy, right? What is it like to live in a world where you may have on paper the same rights as everybody else? You may have, right, a pristine right to vote or right to participate in democratic society, but you know that if you do it the wrong way, someone's going to snitch on you, or worse. Yeah. And the book is trying to show that.
Right. And then I'm going to pitch it to John. And then so my question is going to be, let me just frame it with this context. So when we think of vigilantism, we always think of it as being opposed to authority. So vigilantism and government working together seems sort of like a juxtaposition or a contradiction. So how do we get to this place where, thinking back, like, let's say to 1993 in Waco, we're thinking, okay, here, they weren't necessarily vigilantes with David Koresh, but sort of, they kind of had their own system, their own rules. The idea was that they were essentially fundamentally living within the own framework of what they considered to be the law. So how did it evolve, and how do we get to the place where we started to merge government and authority with vigilantism?
Yeah, and so the questions about vigilante democracy, and now you're getting also into what we're classifying as legalized vigilantism, they sound like oxymorons. They're meant to be, and we use them as a kind of jarring framework to explain just how disrupted and distorted our current moment is. And so I think it's really helpful to start in Waco, or to think about vigilantism of the sort that kind of we grew up on watching TV and watching 1970s and 1980s kind of gritty New York shows
Batman.
where Batman, Death Wish, the Charles Bronson
Yeah.
vehicles, even 24, the Jack Bauer, Kiefer Sutherland
Yeah.
show. It was always these righteous individuals who seethed with indignation because the state is not protecting the weakest among them. And they've taken it upon themselves to go beyond the law, go against the law. And that's actually kind of, if you think about that as our framework, then everything that we talk about today, where there's so much partnering, there's so much collaboration, there's so much looking the other way, while folks who seethe with indignation, who want to change the social order, are doing so pursuant to state law or pursuant to an understanding that the cops are winking at them and saying, go ahead, or with knowledge, such as in Texas, where if you engage in certain types of behavior, you're likely to be pardoned or just never prosecuted because of the politics are with the vigilantes. And so I would actually push us further back and further back towards the Jim Crow era, when the state and private actors were deeply collaborative in a process of repressing newly enfranchised Black citizens to make sure that the hierarchies that were toppled at the end of the Civil War with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not going to be a reality on the ground. And the tactics and strategies used by that collaboration of public and private actors to ensure that the private actors would get their hands dirty, the public actors could say it wasn't us, and at the end of the day, they both got what they want. The private actors got whatever was driving them, seething, angry, got that out of their system, and the public actors got to retain power because they weren't going to be challenged by this cohort of Black voters. And that's kind of where we're putting ourselves in today, and why it's such a jarring move to go from Charles Bronson to these folks in Texas who have the support of state law, to Florida who have this support of state law, because they're not bucking the system. They're not actually even risking that much because this is the new reality pursuant, again, to either statutes or very clear understandings that they won't be prosecuted for taking the law into their own hands. So that's why I kind of want to push us back and take us forward. And the idea about democracy and vigilante democracy itself, which is so paradoxical, is because they wanted the folks who are in charge of this want to transform our democracy into something more thuggish, into something more scary and aggressive. And there's the Adam Serwer comment that the kind of repression of certain targeted groups under the Trump administration, and the phrasing he used was, the cruelty is the point. The cruelty is the end game of all this toxic politics. But we kind of challenge that, and we say cruelty is a means to the end. And the end itself, this is a way of changing our democracy so that those folks, and you read the quote that gets at this, those folks are pushed out of the public arena. So they're less likely to make claims on the public. They're less likely to march in favor of a cause they care about, et cetera, et cetera.
What's jarring to me is that, normally when you do think of vigilantes, like we mentioned a few examples, like Batman, Charles Bronson, and that movie Death Wish, right? You think of these lone vigilantes, right? Even like, I guess like a Kyle Rittenhouse, right? You think of like one person. However, it's jarring to me that it looks like we're actually enabling now not lone vigilantes, but like almost allowing like groups to sort of galvanize and become like vigilante groups in a way, like with the insurrection, for example.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. One of the things we're trying to do in our book is, is point out that sort of this idea you're talking about of sort of organized vigilantes that are acting as an adjunct to what the state is doing. That's our history. John and I are, both middle-aged guys, and we've sort of with the benefit of writing the book, we realized that we've lived in this moment where, yeah, it's kind of nice when you don't have, private vigilantes who feel empowered to impose their will on society this way. But you start looking back to the Jim Crow era, or before that, to the time before the Civil War, and this phenomenon of quote unquote private actors, right? Wink, wink, right? In that case, enforcing white supremacy and doing so, with the backing of the Democratic Party. That is our history, right? We talk in the book about the Fugitive Slave Act, right, of 1793, right? One of the first pieces of legislation that Congress enacts when the Constitution is adopted. The Fugitive Slave Act says, all right, if someone escapes from slavery, well, northern states aren't going to use their police departments, which if they even exist, right, to help people reclaim fugitive slaves. But the slavers were just, fixated on this idea that people would escape from slavery and that undermine the whole system by taking advantage of free states. And so what happens in the Fugitive Slave Act, right? The act gives slavers and agents that they hire the authority to go throughout the entire nation and try and reclaim fugitives. And frankly, sort of the legal mechanisms that it uses to do that, there's a really scary, really eerie parallel between some of the legal tricks that were used in that law and the stuff that we're seeing today, right? Things like setting up lopsided court proceedings, setting up immunities for people who undertake to enforce, quote unquote, the right understanding of the social order. And, the point that I'd make is that you've always got extremists, right? You've always got nuts, and they're going to fall across the political spectrum, right? Right. This book is not saying that vigilantism is only a right-wing problem, right, and is only something that you find in the MAGA right. Although that's certainly where today's surge is. But where vigilantism becomes really worrying is it when it operates with the backing of the state. Because all of a sudden you go from having someone that says, oh, right, this is a crank, right? This is somebody that we can dismiss, to somebody who is operating with the support of the governor, state lawmakers, maybe the head of a political party. And history teaches us that when that happens is when things get really dangerous, because people see themselves having a permission slip to engage in these kinds of activities, and they're emboldened, and frankly, they're just a lot more dangerous.
So, David, I really love that point, and I want to pick up on it. So on this show, we're so interested in the psychology of things. So I want to kind of give you a bit of an anecdote, and not to get into it too deeply, but I think it's super important. So Alan and I, last night, we were driving home, and we were listening to a podcast from Ari Shafir and Dave Smith, I think his name is, the libertarian comedian, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So
I put it on. It's not his
Yeah,
choice.
but now it's interesting that now this is sort of fodder for the show, right?
You got to hear all sides.
Yeah, right. No, but here's what's so interesting about it. So I certainly don't agree with Dave Smith, but what I like how pure of a libertarian he is. So you mentioned, Dave, that when we think of, let's say, these militia movements and let's say these extremists or whatever, right? It's on the far left, on the far right. What's so interesting is that when you look at, let's say, pure communism and pure libertarianism, these are forms, governance systems with no governance fundamentally, right? So the libertarians would say we either want small government. If you get super extreme, it's no government, even though that's super rare, but it's usually like small government, right? So we want taxation for the military, some version of a mild police system, but not really. And then with communism, I mean, the idea is there are these worker co-ops, right? So why am I bringing up Dave Smith? So why I really respect Dave Smith is because he's actually super critical of Trump, and he will say, like, I don't give a shit what you guys think of me because I'm a libertarian. I hate both parties, right? So he's like, listen, if Trump is going to align with more of my views, cool, then that's the person I'm voting for. But ultimately, I don't really care for either one of them. So what I want to kind of get into, right, and I'm actually going to pitch this question to John. How do we get to this point, again, thinking of psychology, where these militia movements that are so fundamentally anti-government, how the hell have they been co-opted by a system that, especially at these extremes, again, for both far left and far right, they detest the one thing that they've been co-opted by?
Yeah, and we have moments where that is completely on display. It was on display in January 6th. In particular, when the police and the protesters didn't really understand each other. I shouldn't even call it the insurrectionists didn't really understand each other. They both thought the others should be on their side.
Right.
And like, in between screaming at each other, hurling invectives at each other, and fighting with each other,
Mhm.
um, there were these exchanges that were captured where they were saying things like, "We don't necessarily understand," they didn't say it like this, but why you're not taking arms with us. Or the other saying,
Right.
I'm a Republican. We're a law and order party. You guys are destroying everything we're a part of. And you talked about before about like ostracization of vigilantes because they're outside of the scope of what is a conventional law and order party.
Mhm.
And even by 2020, you have Kyle Rittenhouse and you have that Missouri couple who were made infamous for running outside in their frumpy but preppy clothes with like
The pistols.
AR-15s
Yeah.
and a pistol, and trying to threaten, harass, and obviously push black marchers way out of their community. And
Mhm.
and we have Kyle Rittenhouse speaking at the conservative political action annual convention to fireworks, and like he's a rock star or WWE star coming out of the runway. And then you have the McCluskey family speaking at the convention. So how did we get there it's the $1 trillion question. And part of it is that the modern Republican Party was an easy marriage, but a very successful marriage between business elites and the social conservatives, the Christian evangelicals,
Mhm.
and they kind of coalesced together. And in part, there was an indulgence and maybe a irresponsible indulgence by the business elites because they thought they had the power, and the foot soldiers would go along with most of the pro-business agenda, and the kind of elites could pay lip service to a lot of the kind of what today looks like Christian nationalist public policy, because there was no way it was going to get through Congress. It was definitely, even if it got through Congress, there's no way the courts would go along with it. So, and then over time, the business elites lost power within the political party. And we can point to different moments. Did it start in 1994 with Newt Gingrich? Did it start in 2008 when Sarah Palin was foisted on John McCain, who had no respect for her, thought her
Right.
politics were toxic, and thought her credibility was non-existent. Um, and then over time, you can see John McCain, or a John McCain, literally John McCain, but also a John McCain Republican, is persona non grata in the party. It's easier to get Kyle Rittenhouse to speak at the national convention than it would be to get Sidney McCain
Mm.
to speak at the national convention. So it's less psychology and more sociology, I guess I'm answering the question. But the phenomenon of a party that kind of consumed itself in ways that the dominant partner became the subordinate partner, which has been essentially become an outcast element, which is the kind of centrist country club Republican, is gone.
Can I add two little points to that? Because
Please.
I agree with everything that John said. Sort of one thing that I've really taken from the work of Lily Mason, who's a political psychologist at Johns Hopkins, is the importance of the point that politics has become people's identity, and this isn't a partisan thing, right? It's that 50 years ago, Americans would define themselves by which clubs they were in, which church they went to, their local communities. You'd be in the Rotary or whatever that is, or, and things like that. And right, for very complex reasons, we now identify with our partisan identity a lot more than we used to. And at the same time that that's happened, right, the political parties have become these ideologically cohesive groups where the Republican Party has transformed into the party that rejects the civil rights project, right, and rejects what they see as woke measures to force inclusivity on people. So part of it, I think, is politics becoming our identity, and right, and it's maybe if politics is just something that you're occasionally engaged in, of course you're not going to storm the Capitol. But if you think it's on you to save the republic, then of course it makes sense that you'd be willing to serve as a vigilante. The other piece that we point to right at the beginning of the book is that people who are engaging in these activities really see themselves being threatened, and they feel that their way of life is under attack. Corporations have gone woke. Teachers are calling school kids by the pronouns that they want to use. We have black prosecutors filing charges against Trump. And for the individuals who are in this movement, they look around and they say, I think this, is part of the explanation for why "Make America Great Again" has been such a powerful political slogan. Is that there's a not insubstantial number of people who look around and say, "My God, what is happening to my country? All I want is the good old days." And that is that feeds into vigilantism, because vigilantism isn't something that you turn to if you can get the votes. Mm-hmm. or if you can get large majorities. It's not a happy, joyous, festive kind of political engagement, right? It is, and we see this in the Jim Crow South. It is a tool of losers who are trying to hold on to power when they know that the political tides are turning against them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as you have sort of a media environment that's just constantly barraging people with the message that they're coming for your America and they're coming for your way of life, we've seen a corresponding uptick, whether it's people filing book bans or all the way up to policing polling sites in January 6th type violence in people's willingness to engage in vigilantism.
It's very interesting that you brought up that people see it as an identity for themselves, right? Like if they align with the MAGA right? Like, what do you think it is going on there? Is it that there are some values that maybe they align with, but then there are other things that are sort of being crafted as part of that identity, and then they just are already so entrenched that there's a certain subsection of that group that would commit acts that maybe otherwise they wouldn't. It's hard to say what's going on there, but it's interesting to me, like how it starts and kind of where it goes. And
it's like a black hole, right? Once you get in a little bit, you're like, shit, now I'm so deep, I have to keep going further, like that.
Plus I mean I could if you align with a certain identity, anything other than that, of course, it does feel like it's threatening your way of life, right? So that does make sense to me.
Yeah, I think you're asking, like, how is it that it's gone so extreme, right?
Yeah, I mean,
essentially, yeah.
We don't want to get out of our skis because we're not political psychologists, but folks have looked at this, and sort of the disturbing fact is that support for the MAGA movement and self-identifying as a MAGA does correspond with sort of regressive views on racial equality, right? And this, the movement starts in response to the presidency of Barack Obama, right? There's these feelings of racial status threat, these feelings that our way of life is under attack. So that's in my opinion, that's a piece of it. John, did you?
Yeah, and just the idea that the more that and it's unclear what's causing and what's reacting, but the more that kind of that everything kind of lines up, and we've talked about in different ways that Republicanism or MAGA Republicanism or Make America Great or whatever it's framed, or left politics, the more it becomes part of your identity outside of the voting booth, and the more you pick stores or you align with brands or sports teams or faith organization, that when you were talking about kind of a black hole, you're so tight, you're so wound up in it that it's such a big change to move outside of it, because everything that you either need or everything that you're told you need or anything that you have an option for, you can choose the left brand or the right brand. You could pick which beer You could pick which sporting league, at least, if not club. And you can shop. You can say, like, we're not a Chick-fil-A family, or we're not a Starbucks family, or we're not a Walmart family, or an Amazon family, whatever it is. Over time, that's become, it's not like management versus labor like it might have been in a different period of time. It's social values or cultural values that that obviously transcend class lines, but kind of play a little bit exploitatively with class line. But I just feel like it's become an all consuming brand, or an all serving brand. And in any other context, like if you go to a mega church that offers daycare and preschool and dry cleaning and this, that, and the other thing, or if you join a fraternity and it becomes like a mini college unto itself within a university. There's these kind of as much as we say, like, America has now bulls alone is a famous political science project. We might bowl alone, but we interact on the internet as tribes, and we consume products as tribes, and we root for teams as tribes. And so it's become very, very tribal of that sort. And like, it's not clear where politics ends and where consumerism begins anymore.
Gotcha. Yeah, and John, I want to go back to something you said earlier and ask a bit of a clarifying question. So, obviously, forgive me if I feel like I'm kind of pushing this a bit too far from where you were going. But I was wondering, were you saying essentially that this kind of the merger between, let's say, fundamentalism and the billionaire class, for lack of a better term, is really just this merger between kind of business interests and then cultural values? There's this kind of like, let's say, tacit handshake where they're like, okay, listen, we'll try to help you create the culture that you want if you kind of allow us to kind of enact or enforce our laws.
Yeah, and I think that at most it was an understanding that that the business elites would never be personally affected, and more likely they thought these policies will continue to support legislation in Congress, but they're never going to go anywhere. They'll never get a majority of our of the nation. So it seemed always a little bit either dismissive or patronizing. But again, at most it would be like, okay, you guys want to do your thing. You guys want to, scream at people seeking abortions. That's fine, because I'll take, if something happens to my kid, I'll take my kid to a private clinic that you've never heard of. Right? There's this idea that you could always insulate yourself from the toxic politics of the masses or whatever. And we're learning that's not true. We're learning that, especially the MAGA Republicans are going right after corporations in a variety of ways that are nothing short of stunning.
Oh, yeah. Wow. And part of the story here is sort of, it's less a story of left versus right as it is a story about these competing factions within the Republican coalition. And with, sort of these vigilante measures that we're tracking, what you're seeing is that, what we could call the culture warrior side of the GOP is announcing that it's fed up with the old system, right? It's fed up with being told we hate abortion, but nothing ever happening in it. And so what they are doing is quite literally seizing power and institutionalizing power in a way that they think is their due, because they put in the work to support, Reagan's tax policies and, all this stuff. And so, as the center of gravity in the Republican Party shifts towards, as they describe themselves, Christian nationalists, you're seeing this almost sort of extraordinary turning on the business elites. Like, it's just, again, I'm showing my age, but it's just incredible that you have sort of leaders of the Republican Party going after, Disney, Target, right? Big corporations that have put in, I don't know the number, but millions of dollars, or if not billions of dollars, into electing GOP officials and getting conservative judges on the bench. And sort of in this moment, and again, I think it goes back to this feeling that, our way of life is under attack, that, something really has to be done. there's almost nobody who's safe from vigilantism once it takes hold. And that's, this is this is an alarming book. And we wrote it because we wanted to sound the alarm about what's going on. But it's, one thing I want people to take is that this isn't going to be limited to LGBT people, right? Or to people who are seeking access to reproductive health care, right? The vigilantes, once they're empowered, they're not going to stop at anything but imposing their understanding of how society should work on everybody.
Yeah, and I think this is the perfect time to now get into some of the more technical aspects. So, John, I'm going to kick it to you. So, can you tell us about the different types of vigilantism?
Yeah, so we break it down into four categories, which are, I think, thematically useful and analytically useful for those who want a more technical understanding of like what are these guys actually talking about in terms of the parameters of vigilantism. But roughly speaking, we classify them in four categories. We talk about dissenter vigilantism, we talk about courtroom vigilantism, and we talk about street vigilantism and electoral vigilantism. And essentially the moves are the same, the techniques are different, but it all starts with private individuals essentially taking matters into their own hands to change public policy in a way that can't or unlikely to be changed through the democratic process. So, for instance, the dissenter vigilantism is all about an individual or a group of individuals being able to opt out of the normal constraints of kind of public regulations. And the examples we talk about are mostly school-based. And they're everything from books to public health measures like vaccinations or masking when that was pertinent. But the idea in the past has always been, if you don't want to comply with generally agreed upon understandings of what's an appropriate curriculum or what's an appropriate way to keep this community safe from contagious diseases, infectious diseases, all that stuff, you can opt out. Okay, you keep your kid home when we talk about sex ed, and then you come back, and if you missed work, that's on you, right? You can, in various ways, if you don't want to vaccinate your kids or whatever, you can find a private school if they're, one could have it, but you don't come into our space and kind of force everyone else to live with the consequences of your decision. And what's changed is the default has switched. And this has been led by actually Glenn Youngkin, who is in many respects, to go back to the last question, the embodiment of the country club Republican who realized there's no politics for country club Republicanism anymore and turned into a culture warrior. And so much of his campaign to win the governorship of Virginia was on parents' rights. And he basically said, if your community says, we're going to do an inclusive curriculum. Which is like, we're going to talk about LGBTQ plus issues. We're going to talk about the sordid history of American racism. In the past, and you wouldn't go to class, to keep kids home those days. But now it's, no, I object. I personally, on behalf of my kid, object to the entire curriculum. You guys need to change the curriculum. Okay, 80% of like fairly liberal Northern Virginia or Central City Richmond want these lessons, but you can object, and everyone else has to deal with it. Okay, and it's the reason why, and I'm going on too long about this one, but in part because it's the least intuitive one. The reason why we're like, well, guys, that's really not vigilantism. That's kind of petty politics. But there is a politics of force and intimidation and harassment, because underlying it is I get to say what counts for the community, and I can do harm to the community that this town doesn't want to exist. The rules about public health are set up to protect the most vulnerable. Even if kids are resilient, it's a recognition that those kids might live in multi-generational families, and they're bringing COVID or whatever, whooping cough or anything home to their grandparents. And so we're going to take the measures we're going to take to keep the entire community safe.
Right. Absolutely.
And so if you can't keep the community safe, the kids from the most vulnerable kids may have to withdraw. And that's a shifting of power. And it's an anti-democratic shifting of power, at least in those communities where we've all collectively decided, we're going to help those kids and their granddads. Okay. Same thing with books. There's a subterranean violence to it, because I know it's right, and we're going to be watching you really carefully to make sure you don't step over the line and teach something about queer studies or Black civil rights or Chicano civil rights. So all this stuff. And that's kind of our kind of entree into successively more kinetically violent forms of vigilantism. So we go from there to talk about courtroom vigilantism, which is most embodied by SB 8 in Texas, which is the anti-abortion private litigation, which essentially empowers and rewards individuals for essentially hunting out instances of abortion in the state. You can go after Uber drivers. You can go after the president of a corporation that has a policy that gives people the day off if they need to seek reproductive care, medical services. You can go after family members who are being supportive, neighbors who are going to help with the recovery. This whole universe of people are all now on the hook financially if you support an abortion. And again, it's confrontational. It's confrontational. I'm getting in your business. Why are you going to the doctor in the middle of the day? And preventing you from doing so. And so the effectiveness of that is not measured in terms of how many lawsuits are brought. The effectiveness is how many companies change their policies, how many people become reluctant to lend the extra bedroom to someone who's seeking medical care because they don't want to be ensnared in litigation. Right. And then from there we go into street vigilantism. And street vigilantism has basically been underwritten by years and years of changes in self-defense law, in the absence or the liberalization of gun laws. So we already have a society in which people don't have to back down from a confrontation, and where people can come, heavily armed into all sorts of civic spaces. Right. And so you get protests, you get marches, you get rallies, you get drag queen brunches, and people are upset about them. People are infuriated by them, and so these show up, and they show up with guns, and that changes the dynamics of who's going to go and rally. Is it worth it to go rally? Are we going to just let it go? Even on the margins, maybe the rally still happens, but 15 or 20% of people don't go. And people with young kids certainly aren't going to go. Right. Because it's too confrontational. And so what does that do for the political potency of a movement in those circumstances? And the place where it's really ramped up is even in a couple of states now, you can drive your car through a protest if the driver has a good faith sense in which their personhoods are at risk, like there's a threat to them. And so we have one unfortunately great quote from Florida where there's people stuck in an intersection as a Black Lives Matter rally proceeds, and the one onlooker screaming at the drivers, "You can crash into them. DeSantis has said it's okay." Wow. Like giving you legal license to essentially ram people off the roads. And then lastly, it takes us to perhaps the most pressing of the forms of vigilantism we talk about, which is election vigilantism. And that happens at every stage of the voting process, from empowering individuals to scrutinize eligibility, to go up to someone and say, I don't think my neighbor belongs on the voting rolls. I want to see the paperwork. I want to see signatures. To, basically stalking out drop centers for ballots, for mail-in ballots, and also polling places. So right now, in response to all this, if you Google the kind of Maricopa County election center, there's pictures like barbed wire of a fortress that's being built. It looks like something in like the Baghdad Green Zone.
It's a prison.
to safeguard, right? It's a prison. It's protect because there was so much harassment in the previous in 2022 and 2020, so much legalized harassment of officials, even after. So you scare off voters, you scare off registrants, you scare off voters. If all else fails, you go after the vote counters. You go and you challenge the votes. You bang on the doors. You wait in the parking lot with guns, like we saw in Nevada and Arizona, or you bang on the windows and make really clear that you're keeping tabs on who's keeping the tabulations, like we saw in Detroit, Wayne County,
Wow.
the election center up in Michigan. These are obviously the areas where voting matters the most because these are the Democratic districts in the swing states. And then in Fulton County, and we had litigation over this, and the election administrators who were most harassed testified before the January 6th Commission. These spoke very clearly about how their lives were turned upside down, how their children were anonymously called and saying, "We know who your mom is," and things like that. And the most important take home from that testimony was not what happened on January 6th, because we all saw that with our own eyes. It's what they said about going forward. They're not going to go back and count votes in 2024. And a lot of people are with them on that. So who's taking over those jobs?
Mm.
People who are seeking conflict.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. And then so what's so interesting about this, and I'm going to try to kick this question out to David. So it's when we think of, let's say, kind of these conflict issues or, whatever you want to call them. I mean, it's always from the perspective of liberty, usually, right? That's kind of the rhetoric. The idea is like, well, you can't really tell me what to do, right? So if I don't want my child engaged in a particular classroom or in a particular course, I have that right? Okay. And then it's okay, well, my body is my choice, essentially. So why is it that, you get to decide you want an abortion, but I can let's say I can't like forego the opportunity to have to get vaccinated, right? So what's interesting is that it's sort of build up, and so even though the rhetoric is one of liberty, what essentially you guys indicate and write about in your book is it's actually just kind of disguised vigilantism. So here's then my question, right? How do we kind of get from the point of liberty to actually no, we want to now reshape this country into let's say a fundamentalist or a Christian nation? How do we get from the point of hey, you can't kind of tread on me, right? You can't tell me how to live my life with my family, etc. To now, oh no, we actually have the right to reshape society in whatever form we fit or whatever form we see fit.
Yeah, I guess I would resist the question a little bit. I'm not sure I would think about this as a liberty issue so much as a democracy issue, right? Because living in a society like ours, with apologies to libertarians, right? There are some issues that we just have to decide as as a democratic collective. You have an infectious disease that travels through the air. There's kind of something absurd about saying how you respond to that is, what do people say, right? An individual decision, right? Or an individual choice, because, whether you get infected, whether you live or die, doesn't depend, I guess, you can be one of those folks who has, like an N100 and never leaves the house and, tries to insulate themselves completely from risk. But the fact of the matter is, right, we're social people, right? And we live in a society and, all of us take, meaning and, what our lives mean comes, not from, what I'm doing, by myself in my apartment, but from the way that we relate to other people and the way that we live in society.
Yeah.
And so John and I see this really in terms of, is the United States gonna continue its halting, imperfect in any number of ways path towards sort of a real pluralistic democracy where everybody has rights to participate in the democracy. And the flip side of that is we go along with decisions that are legitimately democratically made, starting with who's the president, right? Who did the majority of people vote for according to the relevant rules for president. So you do see, you see liberty a lot in the rhetoric surrounding this, and for sure, don't get me wrong, these vigilante schemes, infringe fundamental liberties, and now, what we're seeing is vigilantes going after people who are crossing state lines, in order to right, in order to secure healthcare services. And
can
that's,
can you talk about that? Can you actually get into the weeds of that? I'm so curious.
Oh yeah, for sure. So so down in Texas, there's a sort of a lawyer and an activist who teamed together to pass SB 8, and John mentioned it before. That's the bounty hunter law that holds out a $10,000 reward to anybody who brings a civil suit against someone who who performs an abortion or helps somebody obtain an abortion. And after SB 8 came into effect, doctors and hospitals were just risk averse people were terrified by the risk of these lawsuits, and so you saw access to legal abortion disappear almost overnight. Right, there was an opportunity that the Supreme Court had to stop implementation of the law, which the court passed on. And so, right, this is all before Dobbs. This is while Roe versus Wade was still in effect. You saw abortions disappear in Texas. And almost just as soon, the Williams Institute at UCLA, among other places, has been tracking this. You started seeing huge outflows from Texas to other states. So Colorado, New Mexico, California, Illinois, because people needed access to abortion that they couldn't get in Texas. Now, this, may have been predictable, but it was just infuriating to the people behind SB 8 because, they had come up with what they thought was this genius legal strategy of empowering vigilantes to stamp out abortion. And here, people were continuing to flout them and to refuse to, refuse to carry pregnancies to term, which is their preferred policy. And so what you've seen in Texas cities and counties is some of the same lawyers who are behind SB 8 are pushing local ordinances, which incredibly say, it's a violation of local law to use our interstate highways to travel to another state with the intent to obtain an abortion that's not allowed in Texas. Now, people listening to this are probably going to say, "Oh, that's unconstitutional. There's no way this could happen." It's sort of, it's just sort of so baked into our political and legal culture that that I can take the bridge from New York to New Jersey that we don't even sort of think about having the entitlement to do that.
Right.
But you have to remember that this is sort of the same play that worked with SB 8, where people assumed, of course, this was a constitutional right, but if you just do it, if you just set these these private culture warriors on people, it turns out there's a lot of play in the joints. And even if 3 years from now or 5 years from now, somebody can put together a court case where the Supreme Court, really firmly recognizes a right to interstate travel and says, no, you can't do that. What is happening to people in the interim, right? People are terrorized by these vigilantes. People are changing the way they live. We're seeing reports of people being forced to relocate to other states. And so, you can think of it as kind of legal arbitrage. What they're doing is they're finding the weak points in the system. They're seeing how hard can we push, what can we do that's, sort of lawyers would look at this and say, oh, of course you couldn't do that, but they just do it, right? And then sort of create facts on the ground and try and change our culture and our society through these aggressive interventions.
Are there laws that make it difficult to actually move to another state as well?
Moving, I haven't seen. So far, it's all been in the context of sort of either criminalizing or making it a civil violation to go to other states. John, have you seen any?
I haven't seen
laws?
that. In some ways, I don't think it would be a problem for right-wing legislators and governors for the folks who are most disaffected to leave. I don't think I think there's some kind of compromise between the morality police and the political vote counters. And so to reshape the South to be more white and more Christian and more patriarchal is probably something that they're willing to allow people to flee, just not come back. They don't want in their midst someone who has these even temporary escape routes to get access to the healthcare they need, whether it's an abortion, whether it's providing kind of ongoing gender affirming care for a child. it's the problem about being able to live within the community and still have access to the type of resources that are considered, verboten.
Right.
And something I wanted to ask, especially since we're close to one,
Mhm.
what do you think can be done at a community or policy level to counteract the spread of vigilante democracy? And are there any successful examples of resistance?
Yeah, so we're both pessimistic and optimistic.
Mhm.
I think we're pessimistic because a lot of the mechanisms we thought would have already kicked into place to deal with a lot, at least the excesses of red state vigilantism haven't really done it. I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court had a chance to shut down SB 8. It chose not to.
Right.
We've had opportunity, at least conceivable opportunities for the feds to step in, either through legislation or through a more aggressive Justice Department policing of vigilante behavior in all sorts of settings, like school board meetings, cities, the county board of health meetings, all these measures that at least initially Merrick Garland suggested that these were going to be areas of concern for the Justice Department. He retreated from that rather quickly. So there are at least conceivable federal responses, but we didn't get it in the Biden administration. It's not likely it's going to happen anytime soon, just because it seems as if the national politics are becoming a little more red. The Senate's probably going to turn Republican. There's obviously the White House is up for grabs. So we're not confident that the feds will make a meaningful intervention here. The other folks we thought might step up were the corporations, precisely because now they're in the crosshairs. So the Jim Crow terrorists were only going after the black people. And then, occasionally Jews, maybe later on, Catholics, in the 1920s and things like that. But it was a very discrete set of targets, and you could kind of ignore it if you wanted to. You could say, oh, that's a damn shame, but not necessarily have to fight back. The thing about red state vigilantism today is there's no outer bounds. All right, we're going to go after trans kids. All right, now we're going to go after gay adults. Now we're going to go after black people. Now we're going to go after CEOs. Now we're going to go, kids with autoimmune diseases, right? The number of people being swept in is enormous, and the number of people who are potentially one step removed from being swept in is also enormous. And you would think in this setting, for the stability of businesses and just rationale, these very powerful forces in our society who often get their way on public policy would step up and be like, this just isn't good for our bottom line. But they too haven't stepped up. So then David and I are like, well, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? And we've looked carefully, and the area we think that at least is potentially most propitious for this are blue states. And blue states kind of taking it on themselves to say, we're going to play hardball with you, red states. You guys are doing weird stuff that crosses over, state lines. We're going to do the same thing. And where we have a lot of power is in our economic heft. The state of California, the state of New York, the state of Massachusetts, the state of Illinois, our state of Washington are major economic players. And if they were going to kind of protect their markets from businesses that engage in these types of harassing, anti-civil rights, anti-democracy behaviors, let's close up let's make it tougher to do business here. And the paradigm example we have for this is California did a version of this about animal rights. And so they essentially said, you can't sell certain types of meat products in our state unless you abide by pretty high standards for the kind of protection of the animals while they're alive and the treatment of the animals in the rendering process. It's pretty gross. And that went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was like, wait, can you guys do that? Can you guys use your economic heft to essentially require pork producers to follow California state regulations as opposed to home state regulations? And the court said, yeah, you can. So what David and I are saying is let's treat human rights, let's treat civil rights like we treated animal rights. and put up barriers to those who want to participate in the big markets of New York and California and say, respect civil rights and you can do business here.
Wow.
Interesting.
And so just before we move on to David, John, I know you got to go. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Yes.
John, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and you're in great hands going forward.
Absolutely. All right, man. We'll talk to you soon. All right. David, sorry. So go ahead and your answer.
Oh, I mean, I was just going to add, we talk about blue states in the book, but really, sort of our thought is that any state that is not under the control of a mega legislature and governor should be looking at these measures, because even if you're not a super progressive state, it should be incredibly worrying that people are talking about limiting movement to the state, or sending armed vigilantes into the state who have been mobilized by what's happening in other states.
Right. Yeah, because when you think about, again, liberty, right? So the idea there is that liberty is individual. And so you kind of understand when somebody argues and says, well, it's not right to encroach on my rights. But fundamentally, again, what you're actually seeing under the surface is there's a reshaping of the actual society. So it becomes less about the individual and more about the culture, right? So it's so interesting, again, that when you see these and you hear these arguments, people often say things like, well, it's not fair, for any one group or whatever to affect the culture. But it doesn't seem like they apply it to themselves, because again, their argument on the surface is just, well, it's just my liberty, why should your culture affect that? But it's like, no, dude, you guys are trying to do the same thing. Yes, we are trying to shape the culture, but actually we're at least open about it. You guys are doing this in these nefarious ways under the guise of liberty.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's it's about who has power, and you see sort of this surge of vigilantism, right? It's not an accident that it's directed at BLM protesters and educators who want to provide an inclusive curricula, right? It's because those are ways that, to put it in liberty terms, BLM protesters are saying we want the same liberty to go about our lives and not be arbitrarily subjected to police violence, and so we see this, like I was saying before, right? It's a counter reaction, right? It's backlash against people making liberty demands and equality demands, and those look new and different, right? Compared to when I grew up, yeah, it is kind of a change that schools will talk about racism honestly, or schools will acknowledge the reality of gay parents, and that won't be censored from the classroom. But I think when you think about it, if you say that you have the liberty to keep that from happening in classrooms, right? I have, it just, there's something just fundamentally off about it, where you say, I have the liberty to keep a book off of the school's bookshelves. Like, you can always tell your kid, this is something that our family doesn't believe in. I'd rather that you didn't read this. I don't want you to do that. And
Sure.
Nobody's saying that's a problem, right? The liberty that's being claimed is, it's kind of a misnomer to call it a liberty, because you look at these book banning laws and they're saying, individuals have the power to keep books off, school shelves and out of classrooms, for everybody. And that really takes you to the heart of vigilantism, is right. That is not a democratic move. That isn't, that's not, let's go to the school board and have a discussion about what kind of books we're providing. That's, I have the right to keep you from being exposed to this.
Right. And I want to actually make one final point about that. So I'm a therapist, and what's so interesting is that this is what you see in kind of, I guess, whatever, pop culture, but in the world. So people tend to misuse the term boundary, right? So you would have this, I'm sure you know where this is going, right? So you have this concept of a boundary that says, well, I'm not okay with this, right? So what people sometimes do is they say, well, my boundary is that you don't post such and such picture on social media. My boundary is that you don't talk to such and such person, right?
Yeah.
And then you're thinking, wait, okay, is this a boundary or is this manipulation? Are you trying to control the person, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of that in vigilantism, where there's a lot of talk about liberty again, but then there's the idea that fundamentally it's all about coercion and control. Okay, so as we wrap up, David, final actual thoughts, well, before the final thoughts. So final thoughts, or I guess comments for prospective voters in this election cycle. What would you want to tell them?
Well, I mean, one thing people should be aware of is that vigilantism is on the ballot. So far, what we've been talking about has been something that's happening in the states, right? It's happening in places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee, and is, sort of migrating out to other states for reasons that we've discussed. But if you browse through Project 2025, all 925 pages of it, you're going to see a lot of examples where Project 2025 is saying, look at this great thing Texas is doing. This should be implemented at the national level. And of course, the clearest example of that is the way Project 2025 reads the Comstock Act, which is this, used to be arcane 19th century law that purports to make it illegal to mail articles that can be used for an abortion. For many years, right, Republican administrations and Democratic administrations interpreted the law extremely narrowly. But the same crowd of lawyers that have given us these vigilante regimes thinks that Comstock should be interpreted expansively. And right there, they don't use the name Comstock because it's become something of a political liability. But they say, right, we should adopt this broad interpretation. So, you always want to talk about the stakes in elections, and one piece of the stakes in the coming election is that there's a real threat of a nationalization of these policies, and seeing them imposed by the federal government. People say that's crazy. People also said it was crazy that Roe would be overturned, and right, that this is the world that we're living in now. I think the other thing that sorry for the police car going by, if you're getting that. The other thing that I might mention is that, and I lost my sorry.
Well,
I was going to say the other piece. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, so what would you say then? So just to kind of pick up on your last comment, what would you say to somebody that says, well, Trump keeps harping on state rights, right? So he keeps doubling down and say, hey, I'm not against the federal abortion ban. I'm not against the national ban. What would you say to that person?
So Trump says a lot of stuff. And I think that it's important to recognize that sort of Trump's role in all of this is to get elected and to get power, right? And, if you sort of study the history of Trump, he's a very open deal maker. And so, he will tell people what they want to hear, and he will make deals with different groups. And the real question is not what does Mr. Trump believe, but how are the people that he appoints going to use their power? And, I know there's this whole debate about whether he really believes in Project 2025 and, how much of it to attribute to the campaign, and he disavows it. But one thing I'm certain of is that the same folks who are behind the institutionalization of vigilantism are going to be appointed to really high-ranking posts in the federal government. And the reason for that is simple, right? That's the network, right? That's the network of advisors. That's the network of policy people who he is surrounded with. When you win the presidency, it's a huge job, and you have to act quickly to fill those posts. And it's not like there's some sort of shadow administration of old school conservatives that he hates them anyways, right. But right, that they just don't exist, right? This is what the Republican Party is turning to. And so Trump may act as a check on some of this if there's a lot of political blowback. I think what you're going to see is that if he wins again, there's going to be enormous latitude to implement these policies at the federal level, and it's largely going to take place by people that he appoints rather than by the White House itself.
Right. So he's distanced from it, and he could just say, well, it wasn't really me. These people have power. It's what voters want, etc. I got
exactly.
You. Okay, Alan, final questions for David before we wrap up.
Absolutely. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, follow John's work as well, and of course buy the book, where can we do that?
You can Google Vigilante Nation. I think we're the first thing that comes up, and you'll get links to hopefully your independent bookstore as well as all the big guys.
I love that. Anything on social media for you?
I'm on Blue Sky, David Noll.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Love that.
Awesome.
All right, David, thank you so much for coming out, from both of you. This was super insightful.
Such a great discussion. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Right. Awesome. So, everyone, if you'd like to follow us, you can follow us, of course, at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram. On X, we're at Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe,
Hit the bell on YouTube.
And again, thank you for watching.